There is a quiet force shaping your life more than talent, more than opportunity, more than even discipline itself. It is not something you can see, but it governs nearly every decision you make. It is the need to be approved of, the subtle hunger, to be seen as worthy in the eyes of others. And though it feels harmless, even natural, Stoic philosophy reveals a harsher truth. The moment you begin to live for approval, you begin to lose control over your own mind. You stop acting from principle and start acting from performance. You stop choosing what is right and start choosing what is rewarded. And slowly, almost invisibly, your power is transferred away from you and into the hands of people who may not even care about your existence. The ancient Stoics understood this with disturbing clarity. They knew that no man is free if his inner world depends on external applause. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself again and again that the opinions of others are nothing more than fleeting judgments formed in incomplete minds. Epictetus went even further, teaching that if you surrender your peace to the approval of others, you have willingly become their slave. And yet, despite knowing this intellectually, most people live as if approval is oxygen. They check, they refresh, they wait for validation, like it is a signal that they are allowed to exist fully. But here is the truth Stoicism forces you to confront. Approval is not stability. It is volatility disguised as comfort, because the same crowd that praises you today can ignore you tomorrow. The same voices that elevate you can just as easily dismiss you. And if your sense of worth is tied to something that shifts with mood, trend, and emotion, then your identity is being built on sand. Stoicism begins with a radical correction to this illusion. It divides reality into two categories: what is within your control and what is not. Your actions, your judgments, your discipline, your intentions, these belong to you. Everything else, including reputation, recognition, criticism, applause, rejection, belongs entirely outside your command. Yet approval, addiction, ignores this boundary. It drags external opinion into the center of your identity and hands it authority over your internal world. And the result is always the same. Anxiety replaces clarity. Hesitation replaces action. And your life becomes a continuous performance rather than a deliberate creation. Think about how many times you have held back an honest opinion because you feared disagreement. Think about how many times you altered your behavior slightly, just enough to be liked, just enough to avoid discomfort. Each moment seems small, almost insignificant, but together they form a pattern of self-abandonment. Stoicism does not ask you to reject people. It asks you to stop abandoning yourself for them. There is a profound difference between living among others and living for others. One is connection. The other is surrender. The Stoics were not disconnected from society. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor surrounded by advisors, critics, and enemies. Epictetus taught students constantly. Seneca advised rulers. Yet none of them built their identity on approval. Instead, they anchored it in virtue, in doing what is right regardless of the reaction it produced. This is where true power begins. Not in being liked, but in being aligned, because approval seeking creates a hidden dependency. You begin to monitor facial expressions before you speak. You adjust your tone, depending on who is listening. You replay conversations in your mind, not to learn, but to wonder how you were perceived. Over time, you stop experiencing life directly and start experiencing it through imagined observers in your mind. Stoicism calls this fragmentation of the self. A divided mind can never be strong. A unified mind, however, does not ask, will they approve? It asks, is this right? And that single shift changes everything. When approval is removed from the center of your decisions, something uncomfortable happens at first. Silence appears where noise used to be. Doubt surfaces because external validation is no longer filling the gaps. But within that discomfort, something far more stable begins to form: self-trust. Self-trust is the foundation of Stoic independence. It is the quiet confidence that you can rely on your own judgment even when no one is clapping, even when no one is watching, even when no one understands. But to reach that state, you must first confront one of the most difficult Stoic lessons. You are not here to be universally accepted. You are here to act according to reason and character. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself as a reminder that the world will not conform to his expectations. People will act unjustly, misunderstand intentions, and judge without wisdom. But none of that, he reminded himself, should disturb his inner governance. The same applies to you. You cannot control how people interpret your actions. You cannot control whether they recognize your effort. You cannot control whether they approve of your direction. But you can control whether you remain faithful to your principles in spite of all of it. This is where approval loses its power. Not when it disappears, but when it becomes irrelevant to your choices. And yet, modern life constantly reinforces the opposite direction. It trains the mind to seek immediate feedback. Every post, every message, every interaction is measured in reactions. You are slowly conditioned to equate visibility with value. Stoicism stands in direct opposition to this conditioning. It teaches invisibility is strength when necessary, strategic silence. Not every thought needs expression. Not every achievement needs announcement. Not every action requires external confirmation. There is power in doing things without broadcasting them. There is discipline in building without asking for recognition. Because when no one is watching, your actions reveal who you truly are. And here lies a difficult truth. The need for approval often masks a lack of internal conviction. When you are certain of your direction, you do not require constant reassurance. When you are uncertain, you seek external voices to replace internal clarity. So the Stoic path begins not by rejecting people, but by strengthening your own reasoning, by asking harder questions in solitude than anyone else could ask you in judgment. What am I actually trying to achieve? Is this aligned with my values or my fear of rejection? Would I still do this if no one ever knew about it? These questions dismantle illusion. They remove the need for performance and replace it with intention. And once intention becomes your guide, approval loses its grip. But there is another layer to this struggle, one that is even more subtle. The desire not only to be approved of, but to be understood. Many people confuse the two, believing that if others simply understood them, peace would follow. Stoicism offers a different perspective. Even if you are understood, you are still not free if your peace depends on it. Understanding is still external, still unstable, still outside your control. Freedom is not found in being understood. It is found in no longer needing to be. This does not lead to isolation. It leads to clarity. You can still communicate, still connect, still engage with the world, but without the internal demand that others validate your perspective for it too. Feel real. At this stage, something shifts in your perception of criticism. Instead of seeing it as a threat, you begin to see it as information. Instead of reacting emotionally, you observe it analytically. Is there truth here? If yes, you adjust. If not, you release it without resistance. Epictetus taught that insult only harms you if you accept it as true. The same principle applies to approval. Praise only enslaves you if you accept it as essential. The Stoic remains unmoved, not because he feels nothing, but because he refuses to surrender authority over his emotional center. And this is where most people misunderstand Stoicism. It is not emotional suppression, it is emotional sovereignty. The ability to feel without being controlled, to experience without being dependent, to engage without being owned. When approval no longer dictates your direction, you begin to notice something profound. Your energy returns. The constant mental negotiation of how you are perceived fades. Decisions become simpler. Actions become cleaner. Focus deepens. Because you are no longer splitting your attention between what you are doing and how it will be received. You are simply doing, and in that simplicity lies strength. Yet this path is not comfortable. It demands that you accept being misunderstood at times. It demands that you tolerate silence where praise used to be. It demands that you face the discomfort of standing firm without immediate reinforcement. But Stoicism has never promised comfort. It promises something far more valuable: stability. A mind that does not collapse under the weight of opinion. A character that does not shift with social winds. A life directed from within rather than shaped from without. And so the question is not whether approval will continue to influence you. It already does, in subtle ways. The real question is whether you are willing to see it clearly enough to loosen its control. Because the moment you see it for what it is, a temporary reflection of other people's thoughts, not a measure of your worth, you begin to reclaim something essential. Your attention returns to you. And once your attention returns, your life begins to return with it. Part 1 is complete. Should I continue to Part 2 now? Yes. What most people never realize is that the need for approval does not disappear simply because you understand it intellectually. Awareness is only the beginning. The deeper challenge is behavioral, learning to act without it, learning to move forward even when no external voice confirms your direction. This is where Stoicism stops being philosophy and becomes discipline, because the mind will always attempt to pull you back into familiar patterns. It will whisper that silence means failure. It will suggest that lack of recognition means lack of progress. It will push you to seek reassurance in places where none is needed. And if you are not careful, you will mistake that internal noise for truth. The Stoics called this the disturbance of judgment, not events themselves, but the interpretation you place upon them. Two people can experience the same silence from the world. One interprets it as rejection and collapses inward. The other interprets it as space, as freedom, as an opportunity to continue without interruption. The external reality is identical. The internal response determines everything. This is why Marcus Aurelius trained himself to see events without coloring them with emotional assumptions. Not because he was indifferent to life, but because he refused to be misled by it. He understood that opinion, whether praise or criticism, is nothing more than mental projection from individuals who themselves are struggling with limited perception. If you allow those projections to define your direction, then you are no longer leading your life. You are reacting to theirs. So Stoicism introduces a difficult but liberating idea: strategic detachment. Not withdrawal from life, but withdrawal from dependency. You can participate fully in the world without needing the world to confirm your value. This is where silence becomes powerful. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of intention. The ability to move in quiet, to build without broadcasting, to progress without external validation. In a world addicted to visibility, silence becomes a form of strength that most people no longer understand. ***. When you stop announcing your plans, you stop inviting interference. When you stop seeking immediate recognition, you stop feeding the part of you that depends on reaction. And when that dependency weakens, something unexpected happens. Your focus sharpens because attention is no longer split between execution and evaluation. You are no longer asking, "How will this be received?" You are asking only, "Does this deserve to be done?" And that question alone eliminates countless distractions. But silence is not the only discipline required. There is also restraint, the ability to delay gratification, not only in physical desires but in emotional ones. The desire to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be validated is itself a form of gratification. And like all forms of gratification, it weakens when indulged too frequently. Radical self-discipline begins when you stop feeding that need. At first, it feels like deprivation. The mind resists. It wants feedback. It wants confirmation that it is on the right path. But Stoicism teaches you to tolerate that discomfort without surrendering to it. Because beneath that discomfort lies a more stable form of satisfaction, the satisfaction of self-directed action. You begin to realize something subtle but profound. Approval feels good for a moment, but it does not last. Whereas disciplined action, even in silence, creates a deeper sense of alignment that does not depend on response. One is borrowed emotion. The other is earned stability. Epictetus often reminded his students that freedom is not found in external conditions, but in mastery over desire. If you need praise to feel complete, then you are not complete. You are dependent. And dependency is the opposite of freedom. So the Stoic begins to retrain desire itself, not by suppressing it, but by redirecting it from external validation to internal integrity, from being seen to being aligned, from performance to principle. This shift is not immediate. It is built through repetition, through choosing what is right even when it is unnoticed, even when it is unrewarded. And slowly something changes in your psychology. The absence of approval no longer feels like absence at all. It becomes neutral. Then, eventually, irrelevant. At that point, you enter a different relationship with criticism as well. Most people fear criticism because they still believe approval defines value. If approval makes you worthy, then criticism must make you unworthy. But Stoicism dismantles this equation entirely. Worth is not assigned externally. It is expressed internally through character and action. Once that is understood, criticism loses its emotional charge. It becomes one of three things. Either it is true, partially true, or irrelevant. If it is true, you use it. If it is partially true, you refine it. If it is irrelevant, you discard it without disturbance. There is no identity collapse involved. No emotional reaction required. Just clear evaluation. This is what Epictetus meant when he said that it is not what happens to you, but how you interpret it that matters. Most people do not suffer from criticism itself, but from the meaning they attach to it. They turn an observation into a verdict on their entire identity. Stoicism interrupts that process. It teaches you to separate action from self-worth. You made a mistake, but you are not a mistake. You received criticism, but you are not defined by it. You were misunderstood, but you are not diminished by it. This separation is essential if you want to build anything meaningful in life. Because anything that matters will eventually be judged, and not always fairly. If you cannot withstand judgment without losing yourself, then you cannot sustain long-term creation. And this is where the Stoic concept of obstacle transformation becomes essential. Amor fati, the love of fate. Not passive acceptance, but active integration. Everything that happens is material, even rejection, even silence, even failure. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the Stoic asks, "How can this be used?" Because nothing is wasted unless you waste it through interpretation. A delay becomes time to refine. A rejection becomes redirection. A criticism becomes insight. A moment of invisibility becomes space for improvement without distraction. Life does not become easier under Stoicism. It becomes usable. And once you begin to see everything as usable material, the emotional weight of approval diminishes further. You no longer depend on favorable conditions to move forward. You no longer wait for permission to act. You act because action is aligned with your nature, not because it is rewarded. At this stage, something fundamental shifts in identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone being evaluated and start seeing yourself as someone who evaluates. You become the observer of your own mind, the regulator of your own direction. This is what the Stoics meant by inner sovereignty, not domination over others, but governance over yourself. And in that governance, approval becomes irrelevant because it is no longer part of the decision-making structure. It may still exist in the environment, but it no longer enters the center of your choices. You begin to notice how much mental energy was previously consumed by imagining reactions. How often you rehearsed conversations before they happened. How frequently you adjusted your behavior based on anticipated judgment. And when that pattern dissolves, the mind becomes noticeably quieter. In that quiet, clarity emerges. You see what needs to be done without distortion. You move without hesitation. You focus without fragmentation. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to experience your own life directly again, rather than through the imagined lens of others. But Stoicism does not end at clarity. It deepens into resilience because even after approval loses its authority, life still brings difficulty. External events still unfold unpredictably. People still misunderstand. Circumstances still shift without warning. The difference is that none of it destabilizes you anymore. Marcus Aurelius faced war, betrayal, illness, and political pressure, yet repeatedly reminded himself that disturbance comes from within, not without. The world does not break the mind. The mind breaks itself through misinterpretation. When you internalize this, resilience becomes natural, not forced. You stop asking for life to be easier. You start asking for yourself to be stronger. And this strength is not loud. It does not require attention. It does not seek validation. It simply continues, regardless of recognition. This is the final stage of detachment from approval. Not rejection of people, not isolation from society, but independence from emotional dependency on their perception. You can still engage. You can still communicate. You can still contribute. But none of it defines your internal state. That state is governed by something far more stable, your own principles. And when principles become the center, approval becomes background noise. Sometimes pleasant, sometimes unpleasant, but never decisive. At that point, your life begins to feel different. Not necessarily easier, but clearer. Less reactive, less fragmented, more intentional. You are no longer living as a reflection of external judgment. You are living as an expression of internal order, and in that shift, something subtle but profound happens. You stop losing yourself in the eyes of others and begin returning to yourself fully, without permission. No longer waiting to be approved. No longer needing to be seen in a certain way. Just acting steadily from within, and that is where real power begins.